Spelunkophobia, a term used to describe a fear of caves. Since our earliest ancestors, caves and cave systems have served multiple purposes for many of our species. Uncharted dwellings right underneath our feet that have been used as a means to explore, provide shelter, or as the final resting place for many unlucky enough to be swallowed whole by the Earth's gaping maw. Caves are a bit of an enigma. While we as humans chart caves, explore them, and even make new discoveries in caves, it can be kind of daunting and in some cases terrifying that what seemingly feels like another world or dimension right below us. Cave horror has been quite a subject in media in the last 20 some odd years or so. Movies like The Descent, As Above So Below, The Cave, and more have further solidified our fear about what may lurk in the depths below our feet. Literature has also seen its fair share of cave and spelunking related horror. There is an unrelated book also called The Descent, Junji Ito's popular Enigma at Amigara Fault, and an interesting story of a caver's experiences in an unknown cave in North America that have left some questioning the legitimacy of its claims. Tonight, we will be investigating this story, its history, and more to find the origins of this strange tale. This is the story of Ted the Caver. While it may be up for debate in recent years, the story of Ted the Caver is one of the first creepypastas, if not the first creepypasta to ever be posted and gain some widespread attention around the internet. Mind you, this was a couple years before Slender Man would ever be created, and still a few years off from the creature becoming a full-fledged creepypasta in the mid to late 2000s. That being said, Ted the Caver is a creepypasta originally appearing as a series of blog posts on an Angel Fire page, created in March of 2001. The entire story details a caving expedition conducted by a man named Ted and his friend Brad, anonymously referred to in the story as B, in December of 2000, with most of the entries written on the Angel Fire page being directly taken from Ted's caving journal. The original page is still up if you can believe that, and upon loading up the at this point ancient Angel Fire page, you are greeted to that of darkness similar to a cave. At the top of the page are the words, "Welcome to the page of Ted," and the date of May 19th, 2001. When it was last updated. Below is an image of what is presumed to be a shot from the cave, serving as an entrance to both the story and the mysterious cave itself. After entering, we are taken to an update from March 23rd, 2000, detailing the purpose of this Angel Fire page, stating, "Due to the overwhelming number of requests I have received to tell about my discoveries and bizarre experiences in a cave not far from my home referred to throughout the story as the Mystery Cave or Floyd's Tomb, I have created this webpage. I will outline the events that happened to me during the past few months, beginning with my journey into a familiar cave in December of 2000 and ending, well, it hasn't actually ended yet. I will use my caving journal as the text to tell about my experience. I will give them to you as I experienced them, in chronological order." It should be noted that this story is incredibly long, and was one of the longest creepypastas ever written for the time. For time's sake, I will not be reading the entire story itself, but rather going over several key points throughout the story. With that being said, our mysterious tale starts after Christmas in December of 2000. Ted begins by discussing his and Brad's plan to get one more caving trip in before the coming new year and have found the perfect place to do so. Referred to as the Mystery Cave, Ted mentions that the cave is less than spectacular, but was a nice refresher since the two haven't been caving in quite some time. Ted mentions some of the first details about the cave here. A small passage resides in the lower end of the cave, but is much too small to go through in its current state. It is here that the story provides something that most creepypastas neglect to do so in terms of believability, and that is provide pictures of the hole in the cave with Ted's glove for reference to how small the hole actually is. This image is possibly what most people remember from the creepypasta, and looking back on it now, is a rather ominous beginning image to start with. The hand reaching out of this small hole with a lack of direction on where it's facing is claustrophobic to say the least. It was then that Ted and Brad began working, digging and drilling through the cave entrance in hopes to explore further. Ted gives the mysterious cave the official name of Floyd's Tomb, a rather dark reference to Floyd Collins, a famous caver from the 1900s who tragically died after becoming stuck in a tight crawl space and sand cave, unable to free himself and eventually succumbing to thirst, hunger, and exposure before a rescue party could get to him in time. Ted and Brad would continue to work on getting the entrance to the cave made, greatly underestimating the time it would take to actually getting through the hole in the cave wall. While working, they began to hear what they determined to be as wind howling from the other side of the cave as they sat in the darkness, describing it as a low, eerie noise, as well as the subtle rumbling sound coming from within the cave. Only brushing it off is the sound of trucks driving on the highway near the cave itself. After a while of general exposition on caving and their return trip to the cave and work routine, Ted and Brad hear the same howling and rumbling again, only this time louder and more frequent. They start to question the actual source of the strange sounds, as the highway, while a plausible source of the mysterious noises, was not too busy to begin with. That's when they realized that the sound was actually coming from somewhere deep within the cave. The duo ultimately brushed this occurrence off for the time being, and Ted provides some backstory and history of the cave, mentioning that it was discovered several decades before by construction workers who unearthed its entrance, and how the cave used to be a beautiful, popular spot for cavers and locals alike. However, with time, vandalism, wildlife, and regular use, the cave itself is now merely a shadow of what it once was, with only a few undisturbed areas remaining. After this description and more info dumping on the cave's environment and caving in general, work continues in the next entry as Ted and Brad make their way to the cave, 2 weeks after the initial work routine. Brad mentioned that he asked some of his veteran caver friends what the rumbling noise may be, with the answer being that it could possibly be water deep within the cave, such as a waterfall, but could not come up with an explanation as to why the sound would come and go like it had done previously. Still, this only excited Ted, motivating him to get through the passage and finally solve this mystery. On this trip, they had brought along Brad's dog Whip. Many of you may be wondering why these two would bring a small Jack Russell Terrier into an area that is already dangerous to humans, but they state they've taken Whip on several caving expeditions before, and she always was well behaved. The reason for bringing the dog as well is with the hopes of putting her through the small hole and seeing just how far back she would go into the cave. With that, they are back in the cave working on getting through like usual, though this time, Ted recalls a bizarre experience that he cannot explain. Whip had begun exploring as soon as they got down into the cave, sniffing and darting around and just generally being energetic. However, once they had progressed closer to the work site, the dog began to act differently, sticking by Brad or Ted as they continued to move. After a few moments, she became on edge, only sticking by Brad until they made it to the work site, not even wanting to move forward unless they guided her. It was like she felt or saw something ominous within the cave. As they approached about 20 feet away from the hole, the dog began to whimper, leading to the conclusion that one of them would have to work while the other stayed with Whip. Ted looks back on this situation on a side note with a subtle dread, stating that while they were working, he noticed that Whip would not move at all, and even stranger, would not take her eyes off the cave entrance. Just then, another bizarre happening occurred while Brad was working on the passage. Ted had been taking a break, almost falling asleep, before noticing a puzzled and intense look on Brad's face. He shook his head and asked what's wrong. Brad swore that he could hear another noise emanating from the cave. This time it sounded like a rock sliding on another rock, almost like a grinding sound. After about another hour of work, Ted attempted to see if his head could go through the hole, and easily enough it did. What is odd though is that both Ted and Brad noticed that when Ted had stuck his head through the hole, the rumbling and wind had stopped within the cave. It was here that Ted and Brad began to question what was really going on in Floyd's tomb. Over the course of the rest of the story, they continue to work on widening the entrance, even bringing in a third friend referred to as Joe at one point. Eventually, after much work and toiling at getting this entrance open, they managed to finally do so, allowing for Ted and the rest to finally explore Floyd's tomb. Ted manages to explore briefly as a ghastly scream of unknown origin is heard, and these strange hieroglyphs and symbols are etched in the cave's walls. Later on down the line, the duo managed to get Joe to crawl through the entrance and explore past Floyd's tomb. It is unknown what Joe saw past the portion their light had illuminated, but it is stated in the journal that Joe returned traumatized and sick. After this, Ted decided it was time to explore past the crawl space himself. Bringing a headlamp and a corded phone to keep in touch with Brad, Ted ventured into the darkness beyond Floyd's tomb. While moving deeper into the cave, another loud scraping sound was heard, startling Ted, causing him to jump and bust his headlamp on the cave ceiling. This caused Ted to have to make the trek back, only using glow sticks and a dying flashlight to make his way back. Eventually, the sound of what appeared to be a large rock or boulder being moved had caused the cord on the phone to snap, leaving Ted alone and without communication. Ted came across where the large rock had been originally, now revealing another cave passage, but Ted was justifiably too terrified to proceed into. Ted eventually made his way back to Brad, and the two escaped the cave. though not before something attempted to drag Ted back down with it. The finale to the story is rather bleak. It is detailed in one final blog post on the Angel Fire site dated May 19th, 2001. The final post details how each of the cavers have been succumbing to all sorts of hallucinations and nightmares. It is noted that Ted has been displaying reclusive tendencies and is on long-term medical leave from his workplace. Ted also reveals that he's been having several visual and auditory hallucinations in the weeks since the trip and hadn't seen or heard from Brad or Joe in quite some time, and did not have any plans to until accidentally running into Brad a day before the post. At this point, the hallucinations had become so unbearable and real to Ted that he had begun a routine of sleeping with the lights on. He would see things and figures out of the corners of his eyes, but they would disappear when he would go back to focus on them. This became so frightening to Ted that he had purchased a firearm out of an ad in a paper to defend himself from whatever may be after him. Ted mentions that he spent a lot of time on the internet attempting to look into cave-related folklore and urban legends. Results were thin, only bringing up a cryptid-type creature known as the Hodag, a large bullhorn creature said to be born from the ash of dead oxen who supposedly roamed caves and forest areas in America. On one particularly terrifying night, Ted had experienced an extremely disturbing lucid nightmare in which he had a hard time discerning whether he was actually dreaming or not. The dream entailed an encounter with a mysterious dark figure in Ted's house. The figure itself did not move, but Ted began to back away from it as it seemed to manipulate the lighting in his home. Suddenly, a ringing phone jolted him back into reality. So distraught and unnerved, Ted left his house, feeling compelled to get into his car and drive away. Whether it be fate, pure coincidence, or supernatural beings at work, Ted had driven to an overlook in his compulsion to see the city lights. However, upon reaching the destination in a strange turn of events, Joe had also been there as well. Even stranger was a brief conversation about returning to the cave for some form of closure and that they would meet up at Brad's house tomorrow. Ted then arrived at Brad's house sometime later, mentioning that Brad had seemed normal and somewhat happy, only for his disposition to change when Ted arrived. However, Brad immediately understood the situation, allowing Ted into the home and offering him a spare bedroom to sleep in. The following morning, they began to prepare for the trip to Floyd's tomb. Ted carries with him a rope, camera, food, water, a knife, and the gun he had purchased several weeks prior. Many questions pondered through Ted's mind before the trio set off into the depths of the mysterious cave. I will now read you the last words of Ted the Caver. Although it is difficult to put an exact name on my motivation, I think closure fits quite nicely. I need to find out a few things about this cave. The main thing, believe it or not, is to find the end of the cave. With all the bizarre things I have witnessed these past few weeks, it would seem a bit trite to want, as a primary goal, to get to the end, but that is what I want. To be sure, I will be seeking other bits of knowledge along the way. If, however, I find the end to the main passage and an end to the passage hidden by the rock, I will be content to never return to the passage or the cave again. Never. It would seem to me that crawling headfirst through the tight passage into the darkness is an unnatural thing. It is like crawling up the side of a cliff for recreation, or jumping out of a perfectly good airplane and floating to the ground. We do these things to satisfy our hunger for adventure, this subconscious desire to conquer our own little Everest. As B is fond of saying, caving is the last opportunity for exploration for the person with modest means. True, just as a short drive from just about anywhere in the country is a cave waiting to be explored. Even a cave well known among the general public can be approached by someone for the first time as an adventure, something new, something to overcome, because it's there. Many of you don't agree with my decisions to pursue this cave. I know this from the messages I've received. I'm afraid that I don't have a choice. If I am ever to experience restful slumber, I must return. If I am ever to walk the halls of my own home in peace, I must return. If I am ever to exit the overworld and enter the subterranean world of a cave, I must return. I no longer feel that I have a choice. I must return. For my family and friends who are reading this, I say, be at peace. I will conquer this cave. Then, I will return and update this website immediately. I will include any photos we take in the cave today, and if you stop by the house, I will show you the video I will have. I expect to be at home later tonight, or tomorrow at the latest. See all of you soon, with a lot of answers. Love, Ted. It was here that the Blogspot post abruptly ended, never truly knowing if Ted, Brad, or Joe ever made it out of the cave or even actually set off into the depths of hell itself. And in the over 20 plus years since the cliffhanger ending, many have wondered, speculated, and even asked the question, was Ted the Caver real? Well, the answer may surprise you. In the years since the story's exposure to the internet, many have wondered about the legitimacy of both the details given in the Angel Fire posts and the characters themselves. We are given so many pictures of everyone and the cave itself that goes far beyond what the usual creepypasta did even after this story. The first discussion of Ted's escapades and Floyd's tomb came from forum posts on the National Speleological Society's message board in November of 2004. It was here that a poster by the name of Ralph Powers had mentioned that he actually knew Brad in real life, and that Ralph had also visited the cave at one point as well. Powers had explained that the cave was located under an interstate, which could have possibly been the source of the rumbling and strange noises that had occurred in the story. In January of 2006, another poster by the name of CAVER Dale also backed this up, claiming that the real name of the cave was Interstate Cave and was located in the state of Utah. After this, the story began to sort of blow up across several forums and message boards like Snopes, Facepunch, bodybuilding forums, and more about the origins of the story and if it was ultimately real or not. Often when discussing the story of Ted the Caver, another story is mentioned along with it. In 2004, a story titled Fear of Darkness by author Thomas Lara began being circulated about a similar setup taking place between 1987 and 2004, and was starting to be believed as the original story. Despite this, out of the depths of Floyd's tomb, a ghost with a familiar name seemed to arise from the darkness. On January 5th, 2005, a poster with the name Ted started a thread on the National Speleological Society's message board, stating that Ted the Caver was his original work, and elaborated on how the story was simply a retelling of real experiences and events, but with supernatural aspects thrown in to give the story an entirely different feeling. Ted goes on to state in the thread that, as Dale mentioned, the cave was opened in the 70s, so someone could have been through before 1987, but not the new passage. As Ralph stated, and the pictures show, the story accurately describes the Floyd's tomb section of the cave, the opening, and the passage beyond, although I did take a few creative liberties there with the description, such as the Blair Witch hieroglyphs and the round rock, and Ralph, Dale, or any one of dozens of Utah cavers can testify to the approximate date that the passage was open. Now, did Thomas Lara see all of this in a crystal ball to write about it accurately, or did somebody swipe my work? Since the last blog post all those years ago, Ted the Caver has become a staple in internet horror and urban legend. Aside from being one of the earliest creepypastas, a genre of story and writing that would later go on to define and inspire an entire generation of horror and horror enthusiasts, including myself, Ted the Caver also broke new ground in 2008 when independent filmmaker David Hunt directed a movie adaptation of the story titled Living Dark: The Story of Ted the Caver, serving as one of the first and still one of the few creepypastas that were adapted into movies, though the film's reviews are expectedly mid to low. Though Ted the Caver is somewhat largely irrelevant and even forgotten or never heard about in recent times, it cannot be denied that its efforts and release helped kickstart and grow a larger community of independent horror literature. Ted the Caver today is pretty inaccessible to most creepypasta readers, with its length, deep descriptions of cave knowledge to the point of alienation, and generally unsatisfying ending. Ted the Caver may not be a good first read to get into when being introduced to creepypastas. However, even today, its influence is undeniable and its legacy will live on as more pieces of internet horror literature and media will continue to be produced. So, if you have some time to kill or are looking to read into a classic piece of creepypasta history, then I implore you to put on your headlamp, grab your dissension rope, and delve headfirst into the story of Brad, Joe, Whip, Floyd's tomb, and Ted the Caver. This has been Yoshimi, and have a good night.